Lubang Island lies to the west of Luzon, separated from the main Philippine landmass by a stretch of open water exposed to seasonal winds. Lubang Island is narrow and uneven, marked by low mountains, dense forest, and strips of cultivated land along the coast. Rivers cut through the interior during the rainy season, then recede into quiet channels. The shoreline alternates between rocky inlets and small beaches where fishing boats once came and went without record. In 1945, the island held no major city and no permanent military installation of scale. Coconut groves bordered villages built from wood and nipa palm. Carabao moved slowly across fields. Footpaths connected settlements to the hills. Beyond those paths, the jungle thickened quickly. Bamboo, tall grass, and hardwood trees created layers of shade that concealed movement after only a few steps. The Pacific War had reached the Philippines with force, but on Lubang the rhythm of daily life returned in fragments after the fighting passed. Burned structures remained in some areas. Ammunition casings lay rusting in soil. Yet the forest continued its steady growth. Rain fell. Crops were replanted. The island did not announce what it concealed. From the shoreline, the interior appears continuous and silent. Sound travels unevenly beneath the canopy. Distance is difficult to judge. A person can disappear within minutes, absorbed by terrain that does not reveal its boundaries easily. For decades, parts of this landscape would remain occupied by a single unresolved command. Hiroo Onoda was born on March 19, 1922, in Kainan, Wakayama Prefecture, Japan. Hiroo Onoda grew up in a country shaped by rapid modernization and expanding military ambition. His father had served in the Imperial Army, and discipline formed part of his early environment. After finishing school, Onoda worked briefly for a trading company in China. In 1942, as the Pacific War intensified, he was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army. Unlike many infantry recruits, Onoda was selected for specialized training. He was sent to the Futamata branch of the Nakano School, an institution dedicated to intelligence and guerrilla warfare. Nakano School trained officers in unconventional tactics, infiltration, sabotage, intelligence gathering, and survival behind enemy lines. Cadets were taught to operate independently, to live off local resources, and to resist surrender under all circumstances. The curriculum emphasized endurance and secrecy rather than open battle. By late 1944, the strategic position of Japan in the Pacific had deteriorated. American forces were advancing through the Philippines. In December 1944, Onoda, now a second lieutenant, received orders assigning him to Lubang Island. His mission was not to engage in direct confrontation but to conduct guerrilla operations once Allied forces landed. He was instructed to destroy the island's airstrip and pier facilities if possible and to prevent enemy use of local resources. Before departure, his commanding officer reportedly gave a final directive: he was forbidden to take his own life, and he was to continue operations no matter how long it took. The war, he was told, might last 3 years, perhaps 5. He was assured that the army would return for him. On December 26, 1944, Onoda arrived on Lubang Island. The Japanese garrison there was already strained. Supplies were limited. Coordination was uneven. Within weeks, American forces would land nearby, accelerating the collapse of organized resistance. At the time of his arrival, Onoda was 22 years old. He carried a rifle, ammunition, and training intended for prolonged isolation. The island that appeared remote from the sea was about to become his assigned battlefield, though its final shape would not resemble the war he had studied. In February 1945, American forces moved against positions in the western Philippines as part of the broader campaign to retake the archipelago. United States Army units landed on Lubang Island on February 28. The Japanese garrison, already fragmented, offered limited resistance. Many soldiers were killed quickly. Others retreated inland. Onoda did not succeed in destroying the airstrip or harbor facilities as he had been ordered. Senior officers on the island had conflicting priorities, and coordination broke down before a systematic defense could be organized. As American troops advanced, groups of Japanese soldiers fled toward the hills. Among them were Onoda and several enlisted men who would remain with him, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Yuichi Akatsu, and Private Kinshichi Kozuka. Within days, conventional resistance ended. Organized Japanese command on Lubang collapsed. Those who surrendered were taken into custody. Those who escaped into the interior faced a different form of existence. The 4 men carried rifles and limited ammunition. They avoided villages and established concealed positions in the forest. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's acceptance of the Allied terms of surrender. The broadcast reached major cities and military commands, but it did not reach the interior of Lubang Island in any direct form. In the weeks that followed, aircraft flew over remote regions of the Philippines, dropping printed leaflets that declared the war had ended. Leaflets fell into the forest around the 4 men. The documents contained copies of the imperial rescript announcing surrender. They urged remaining soldiers to lay down arms and report to authorities. Onoda and his companions examined them carefully. The language appeared formal. The seals looked authentic. Yet they concluded the papers were enemy propaganda intended to flush them out. Their training had prepared them to distrust such messages. They had been instructed that Allied forces would attempt deception. The war, in their assessment, had shifted into a phase of irregular conflict. They interpreted the absence of direct contact from Japanese command not as confirmation of defeat, but as evidence of ongoing secrecy. From that point forward, the possibility that the war had ended existed only as a claim delivered by the enemy. Onoda chose not to accept it. By late 1945, the 4 remaining soldiers had reduced their movements to the forested center of Lubang Island. Lubang Island offered steep slopes and dense vegetation that limited visibility beyond a few meters. Trails were used briefly and then abandoned. Camps were temporary. Fire was controlled and often avoided during daylight. Onoda assumed command of the small group. His training at the Nakano school shaped their structure. Positions were assigned. Watches were rotated. Ammunition was counted and preserved. They carried Arisaka rifles, each weapon maintained carefully against rust in the humid climate. Oil was scarce. Cleaning required improvisation. The decision to remain in the jungle was no longer provisional. After months without direct engagement from Japanese forces, the 4 men accepted that they were operating independently. They concluded that communication lines had been disrupted but not permanently severed. Their mission, as they interpreted it, remained active. They would gather intelligence, conduct sabotage when possible, and await reinforcements. Occasionally, they observed villagers at a distance. They avoided contact unless seeking food. Rice was taken from storehouses at night. Bananas and coconuts supplemented their supplies. Cattle were sometimes slaughtered quickly and divided among them before they retreated again into cover. Each leaflet that appeared in subsequent months was examined and dismissed. Newspapers left behind by search parties were read with suspicion. Reports of Japan's defeat were interpreted as fabrications. The group's reasoning followed a consistent pattern: if the empire had truly surrendered, a direct officer would come to relieve them. Until such an order was delivered in person, they would remain in the field. The forest became both shelter and boundary. With each passing season, their position hardened from temporary concealment into long-term occupation. The point at which return seemed immediate passed quietly. In its place remained a standing order that none of them believed had been revoked. The 4 men established a routine shaped by concealment and repetition. Days were divided between observation, maintenance, and movement. They avoided constructing permanent shelters. Instead, they selected temporary campsites beneath thick canopy or along ridgelines that provided limited vantage points. When they sensed increased patrol activity, they relocated without leaving visible traces. Food determined much of their schedule. Lubang Island's interior provided fruit in season. Bananas grew in cultivated areas near villages. Coconuts could be taken from groves closer to the coast. Wild root crops were dug from forest soil. At night, they sometimes entered fields to gather rice left drying after harvest. On other occasions, they killed cattle grazing at the edges of settlements. Meat was smoked briefly to preserve it, though the process risked detection. Ammunition was treated as finite and irreplaceable. Each man carried his rifle at all times. Cleaning the metal in a humid climate required care. Cloth strips were reused. Oil, when available, was rationed in small amounts. The rifles were wrapped during heavy rain. Cartridges were kept dry in improvised containers. Clothing deteriorated quickly. Uniform fabric frayed and tore. They repaired garments with thread taken from abandoned houses or stitched fibers drawn from other materials. Over time, the original military appearance faded into patched layers adapted to jungle conditions. Footwear was replaced with sandals assembled from rubber or cloth when boots failed. Communication among the four remained formal. Onoda retained authority as the ranking officer. Decisions regarding movement or engagement passed through him. Discipline was enforced through shared agreement rather than punishment. The structure of military hierarchy, though reduced to 4 individuals, remained intact. Leaflets continued to fall at irregular intervals. Some included photographs of family members and messages urging surrender. In 1952, letters from relatives were dropped over Lubang, arranged by the Japanese government in an effort to persuade remaining holdouts. The men read them carefully. They noted familiar names and handwriting. Still, they concluded that coercion or forgery was possible. Their training had prepared them for psychological warfare. Encounters with local police or search parties occasionally escalated into brief exchanges of gunfire. Shots were fired quickly and without extended pursuit. The group relied on knowledge of terrain to withdraw before encirclement. Casualties among local residents and authorities occurred during these years, documented in Philippine records. The men interpreted each clash as confirmation that hostilities continued. Time passed in cycles rather than in measured years. Rainy season followed dry season. Fruit ripened and disappeared. Rice harvests returned. The men tracked months loosely, marking anniversaries based on memory rather than calendar. Without confirmed news, global events did not register. The Korean War began and ended without their awareness. Political changes in Japan occurred beyond their horizon. In 1949, after nearly 4 years in hiding, Yuichi Akatsu separated from the group during one movement through the forest. Yuichi Akatsu remained alone for several months before surrendering to Philippine authorities in March 1950. His departure reduced the group to 3. Onoda interpreted the surrender as weakness rather than evidence of peace. The structure of waiting adjusted but did not collapse. 3 rifles remained. 3 watches rotated through the night. The forest absorbed their presence, and their mission, as they understood it, continued without visible end. After Akatsu's surrender became known publicly, information about the remaining soldiers began to circulate. Reports in Japan suggested that at least 3 men were still active on Lubang Island. Search parties were organized intermittently through the 1950s. Japanese officials, sometimes accompanied by family members, traveled to the island and called into the forest using loudspeakers. They urged the men to come forward. Newspapers were left behind as evidence of changing times. Onoda and the 2 remaining soldiers, Corporal Shoichi Shimada and Private Kinshichi Kozuka, listened from concealed positions. Shoichi Shimada and Kinshichi Kozuka shared the same conclusion as their commander. The presence of search teams was interpreted as strategic deception. They reasoned that Allied forces could compel Japanese civilians to participate in staged retrieval efforts. No direct superior officer had appeared to countermand their standing orders. Through the early 1950s, encounters with Philippine authorities continued. Patrol units attempted to locate the group after reports of gunfire or stolen livestock. These operations were limited in duration. The island's terrain complicated pursuit. Each exchange reinforced the perception that combat conditions persisted. In May 1954, during one such encounter near a beach on Lubang, Shimada was shot by a search party led by Philippine police. He died shortly afterward from his wounds. His death reduced the group to two. Onoda and Kozuka retreated deeper into the interior once again, carrying their remaining ammunition and supplies. Years passed without decisive change. Occasional leaflets continued to fall, some announcing major events: the end of occupation in Japan, the Tokyo Olympics, economic growth. The men evaluated these claims but remained skeptical. The pattern of alleged news was interpreted as cumulative propaganda. Without direct command verification, none of it altered their stance. By the 1960s, the world had shifted dramatically beyond Lubang Island. Japan had rebuilt its cities and re-entered international society. The Pacific region had stabilized into new political alignments. On the island, however, the routine of concealment persisted. Onoda and Kozuka aged within the forest. Their uniforms were now indistinct from improvised civilian clothing. Hair grew longer. Equipment was repeatedly repaired. Rifles remained functional through careful maintenance. The two men maintained a pattern of periodic cattle raids, which drew increased attention from local authorities. Each incident renewed efforts to capture or neutralize them. In October 1972, nearly 27 years after the war's end, Kozuka and Onoda were encountered by a Philippine police patrol while burning harvested rice they believed belonged to enemy forces. Gunfire followed. Kozuka was shot and killed. His body was recovered and identified. Onoda, then 50 years old, was alone. After October 1972, only one rifle remained in the forest of Lubang Island. Kenshichi Kozuka's death marked the end of the last partnership in Hiroo Onoda's long isolation. For nearly 3 decades, the group had preserved a structure of shared responsibility. Now, at 50 years of age, Onoda moved alone through terrain he had memorized in fragments rather than as a whole. Philippine authorities confirmed Kozuka's identity through fingerprints and records retained from the war. News reached Japan that a single holdout likely remained. Public interest, which had resurfaced periodically over the years, intensified again. Yet on the island, the pattern of movement changed very little. Onoda continued to shift camps regularly. He avoided predictable paths. He maintained his rifle with the same discipline he had practiced since 1945. Ammunition was counted and conserved. Clothing was patched repeatedly. Fires were small and concealed. He remained alert to search parties, which resumed efforts to locate him after Kozuka's death. Time, at this stage, no longer followed clear divisions. Seasons marked progression more than dates. The forest that had once seemed expansive now functioned as a closed circuit of remembered clearings, streams, and ridgelines. Physical endurance was tested by age. Nutritional variety was limited. Illness was managed without medicine. In February 1974, a Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki arrived on Lubang Island. Norio Suzuki had stated publicly that he intended to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. His search was independent, not officially sanctioned by government authorities. He entered the forest alone. On February 20, 1974, Suzuki encountered Onoda. The meeting occurred without gunfire. Suzuki identified himself as Japanese and explained that the war had ended long ago. Onoda listened but did not accept the claim as sufficient. He stated that he would surrender only upon receiving a direct order from his superior officer. Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs and confirmation that Onoda was alive. The final condition that Onoda had maintained for nearly 30 years had now been stated clearly: only formal command could conclude his mission. Following Norio Suzuki's confirmation, arrangements were made in Japan to meet the condition Hiroo Onoda had maintained since 1945. His former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, had long since left military service. Yoshimi Taniguchi was located and agreed to travel to the Philippines. On March 9, 1974, Taniguchi arrived on Lubang Island. He wore civilian clothing. The Imperial Japanese Army no longer existed in its wartime form. Japan had adopted a new constitution, renounced war, and reorganized its armed forces. Nearly 3 decades had passed since Onoda had received his original orders. Taniguchi was escorted to a designated meeting point in the forest. Onoda appeared in uniform fragments that still resembled the attire of a second lieutenant. His rifle remained in working condition. He carried his sword, a symbol of rank that had survived years of exposure and repair. Taniguchi read formal orders relieving Onoda of duty. The statement declared that the war had ended on August 15, 1945, and that all combat operations were to cease immediately. It acknowledged his service and instructed him to surrender. Onoda listened and accepted the directive. He removed his sword and handed it to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos during a later ceremony. Ferdinand Marcos granted him a full pardon for actions committed during his time in hiding, despite documented incidents in which civilians and police officers had been killed. On March 10, 1974, Onoda formally surrendered his rifle and remaining ammunition to Philippine authorities. The weapon was examined and found to be functional. The ammunition, though aged, had been preserved carefully. The transition from jungle isolation to public recognition occurred quickly. Photographs were taken. Statements were issued. Onoda stood in uniform before officials and journalists. He was 52 years old. The war he believed he was fighting had ended nearly 29 years earlier. The order concluding his mission had arrived in person, as he had required. Following his surrender, Hiroo Onoda returned to Japan. His arrival attracted significant attention. Reports emphasized the extraordinary length of his isolation, but public discussion remained factual rather than celebratory. Onoda did not issue dramatic statements. He described only the conditions of his routine and the orders he had followed. In the months after his return, he spent time with family members he had not seen for decades. Adjusting to life in a society transformed by economic growth and cultural change was gradual. The country he had left as a young officer had experienced reconstruction, political reform, and social modernization. He observed these changes quietly, without assertion or commentary on their meaning. In the late 1970s, Onoda moved to Brazil. He purchased farmland and continued a life of relative seclusion. He applied skills from his military training to agriculture and maintenance of his property. His movements remained methodical, and his daily routines emphasized discipline and self-sufficiency. Throughout his later life, Onoda occasionally spoke to journalists or historians about his experiences. He emphasized obedience to orders, survival through planning and discipline, and the physical and mental demands of prolonged isolation. He acknowledged the deaths of comrades and the consequences of engagements with local authorities, presenting them without embellishment. Hiroo Onoda died in 2014 at the age of 91. Records indicate that his death was due to natural causes. His life has been studied as a historical example of extended military obedience, the challenges of long-term survival in hostile environments, and the psychological endurance of individuals isolated from conventional society. The forest of Lubang Island, where he spent nearly 3 decades, continued without observation. Paths he had traced gradually faded. Fires left long ago had extinguished. The land absorbed traces of human occupation and returned to a rhythm independent of wartime commands. Onoda's story remained in the records, in photographs, and in testimony from those who encountered him. The significance of his survival lies in its documentation. It illustrates the persistence of trained discipline, the influence of orders on human behavior, and the endurance of the human body and mind in conditions of sustained isolation. The forest remained silent, and the island's quiet presence continued, as it had when he first arrived nearly 70 years earlier.